Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing really well. Jessica, that was a really interesting presentation. The paper, well, I'm going to use paper and research interchangeably because what I'm going to be presenting on today is my LLM research, actually. And it's quite unfortunate that this conference happened before I could reach the stage of drafting the main chapter of the study, which is the legal aspect of the study. But it's okay. I'll just briefly discuss that. So the title of my presentation is the legal reflections on private investments in green transport infrastructure in South African cities. So by legal reflections, as you will see in the presentation and in the discussion, one means the assessment and the reflection on all applicable and accommodative laws and legislation to private investments in green transport infrastructure. And at the beginning of the studies, by cities, I wanted to mean like metropolitan cities. However, it merits that if I want the study to make an impact or a contribution in any shape or form, we should include underdeveloped and poorly managed cities where there is no sign of sustainable development. In this manner, we can determine to what extent the level of developing green transport infrastructure will be, and what it really requires for green transport infrastructure to be developed on all scales of cities, on all sizes of cities. So this is the outline of the study. As you will see, we will start by addressing the question as well as break it down and discuss the premise in which the research question is being asked. And then further, to better understand the title of the study and the research question and this, the study as a whole, we will delve deep into the definition of green transport infrastructure in the international perspective and then narrow it down to the South African perspective. And then after that, you'll realize that the green transport infrastructure is not just any infrastructure, and it is costly in as much as it is desired. So we will have a mini discussion on the concepts and tools that can be used by the private sector to actually provide financing options for the development of green transport infrastructure in cities. However, we will focus on private investments, as the study is focused on private investments. And then there will be a brief discussion on the South African legal framework applicable to the concept of private investments in green transport infrastructure. Okay, so getting right into the presentation and discussion, the question being posed is how and to what extent does South African law facilitate or hinder private investments in green transport infrastructure in the country's cities? So when thinking about the question and when phrasing the questions, there are four aspects that I looked into. One being what lacks in our infrastructure environment, and particularly which sector. Number two, what are we as a country striving to achieve in terms of sustainable development? Are we only looking at socioeconomic development, or are we looking at environmental development or sustainable development in all three aspects? Number three, how can this be achieved where there's a lack of financial capacity in the private sector? And then the fourth aspect was how South African law will legally regulate the aforementioned aspects. Okay, so the premise of the research question was primarily based on the top 3 points, which is urbanization, socioeconomic challenges, and the needs and demands, specifically transportation and mobility needs and demands. So to start off, most countries are facing rapid urbanization marked by challenges such as overpopulation, the continual rise in population, and poverty. And South Africa is not an exception to these challenges. Inadequate mobility is also one of the challenges associated with urbanization as well as population growth in South African cities, where transportation and mobility is unsafe, it's inefficient, it's unavailable due to the high demands as well as infrastructural challenges. And this ultimately leads to the lack of linkages between rural and urban areas, and this ultimately leads to the to individuals to individuals being unable to access social and economic activities and basic needs, and this deprives them of the opportunity to actually contribute to the society and have their social and basic needs met. So therefore, the study focuses on the city transport infrastructure that is environmentally sustainable while also meeting the social demands and being economically viable. However, as I mentioned before, green transport infrastructure is as costly as it is desired. So as you have seen by recent news of the looting of funds by the public sector that were to be allocated to so many sectors during the pandemic, you'd see that there's a lack of financing and financial management. So in this context of transport infrastructure, there's also a lack of financing capabilities and management to fulfill the mobility needs and demands. And this led to the one of the most important aspects of this study. So because the public sector has limited financial resources to fulfill these mobility needs and to actually provide more sustainable transport systems and transport infrastructure, the public sector had to source more viable alternative financing options. And this need for the public sector to source these options is occasionally satisfied by the borrowing and attracting of capital from private investors. However, the private investors are motivated by the aim to generate and maximize profit. So then if this is the case, that the private sector has no obligation to actually contribute financially to the building and development of infrastructure, the question will be, how will the law regulate decisions and actions related to such? And furthermore, the question will arise whether South African legislation has provisions for the protection of investments to facilitate a well-established and sustainable investment environment for private investments in green transport infrastructure. So to give everyone a mental image on what green transport infrastructure actually is, we can start by the broad widened definition of green infrastructure. So the concept of green infrastructure arises from the acknowledgement that natural systems are equally as, if not more, essential to societal and economic well-being than what is considered as ordinary infrastructure. However, green infrastructure is not restricted to public systems and services necessary for economic growth. So as you can see on the screen, the definition of green infrastructure is a network of multifunctional green space, both new and existing, both rural and urban, which supports the natural and ecological processes and is integral to the health and quality of life of sustainable communities. So green infrastructure elements vary in their functions, both primary and multiple functions. Therefore, applicable to transport infrastructure, it can also offer a wide range of new and improved transport systems and infrastructure that support the green economy and also improves environmental conditions, subsequently improving the people's health and lives. So a straightforward understanding of what green transport infrastructure is would be the relevant transport infrastructure that collectively does not leave problems or costs for future generations to solve or bear. Present builders and users of the system should pay such costs today. These costs are not limited to environmental externalities, but also include social and other economic impacts caused by transportation. So this specific definition relates to Section 24 of the Constitution, where everyone has the right to a healthy environment and for that environment to be protected while justifiably promoting social and economic development. Because such as spatial inequality, green transport infrastructure in South African cities would refer to transport infrastructure in cities that is economically and socially sustainable, meeting the transport mobility and associated socio-economic needs of people. Taking into consideration that the study is based on infrastructure in South African cities, it merits that we should have a brief discussion on the SDGs that are applicable, particularly SDG 11. So SDG 11 has the goal to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. The trend of urbanization in cities being accompanied by increased pressure on the environment and accelerated demands for essential services and adequate infrastructure. This has proven that mobility, transport systems, and sustainable transport infrastructure is actually vital in achieving Sustainable Goal 11, as sustainable mobility in general, is needed for the delivery of these services. Additionally, SDG 11 calls for safe, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all by improving road safety and expanding public transportation. So relevant to sustainable transportation systems and development of transport infrastructure, Target 11B of Goal 11 encourages the integration of transport policies and plans towards inclusion, resource efficiencies, mitigation, and adaptation of climate change, which determines the effectiveness and resilience of transport systems. So transportation systems and transport infrastructure in the general sense find relevance in other SDGs, whether it's direct or indirect. And for example, transportation infrastructure and transportation in general find relevance in Sustainable Goal 9 and 13. So traditionally, the public sector would be the sector that actually provides financing for development of transport infrastructure. However, this financing is limited to the country's budget flexibility and also the borrowing capacity. So therefore, in the face of increasing needs of the society, the private sector is, it makes it evident that the private sector has to source alternative forms of funding, and then private sector financing is such alternatives, and there are various ways in which cities can attract private financing, which is by loans, bonds, even hybrid agreements such as public-private partnerships. However, for purposes of this presentation and to keep it short, we will focus on private investments. So there are two ways in which to answer the question of why private investments. The first one is in a manner that accommodates both the private and public sector, as well as, and the second one is in a manner that's solely based on the private sector. So investments in transport infrastructure presents a unique opportunity to meet both the growing transport demands and developmental goals. Alongside the environmental benefits, sustainable transport can improve economic and social development by, say for example, allowing people access to jobs, markets, and social interactions. So this can be described as a win-win situation where the private sector generates and maximizes their profits, while the public sector gets quality infrastructure for the society. Furthermore, as the entire world moves to the fourth industrial revolution, and in conjunction to Sustainable Goal 9, private investors have no interest in investing in past technologies, only in innovative and futuristic technologies and innovativeness. This is exactly what South African cities need for innovative infrastructure that will last for future generations. So for this aspect of the presentation, I will just briefly discuss which fields of flow, if you would say, that you would find, because I'm still busy with this chapter of the study, and any critical feedback would be really appreciated. As mentioned before, the ability of private investments to be sources of finance for the public infrastructure will depend on South Africa's legal framework and the legal climate set out for such investments and sustainable infrastructure. So relevant to green transport infrastructure, Section 24 of the Constitution ultimately refers to the right to a healthy environment tied to air pollution in this context, as well as the protection of environments while promoting social and economic development. And as sustainable infrastructure is a need with the society, green infrastructure in this context will be looked at in a rights-based approach instead of looking at it as an approach to pursue the demands arising from urbanization only. So Section 24 also opens up ways in which green transport infrastructure finds applicability in different fields of law. Say, for example, in determining whether the law accommodates development of green transport infrastructure, environmental laws, say, for example, your National Environmental Management Act, can find application, and the principles will be dissected and finding out whether green transport infrastructure applies, if there's any application. Also, characteristics of green transport infrastructure may vary and may include the use of energy efficient measures. And in this sense, identifying these measures also entails identifying regulations, laws, and legislations relating to the use of energy efficiency in the environment, in the infrastructure environment. Additionally, and most importantly, we will look at the investment and finance, both from the perspective of the private sector as well as local government finance law. For example, your Municipal Finance Management Act, Public Finance Management Act, and then legislation focusing on transport infrastructure development and accompanying laws will get us closer to actually realizing and understanding whether green transport infrastructure is actually encouraged, and if so, what are the financing options that are encouraged as well to lead us to the achievement of such legislation, such as the Infrastructure Development Act and transport-related and road acts, strategies and policies will also be used to identify the status quo of how the former and the latter make provisions for sustainable development of transport infrastructure. So I think it would be artificial for me to actually give you guys a conclusion or recommendations, but I'll end off with the hypothesis of my study, which is the South African legal framework encourages private investment in green transport infrastructure. Thank you.